Thank you. And our final presenter is Dermot Loughnane from Tactical Marine Solutions in Canada. No, well, you're the last. And then we get questions. Okay. Oh, I take it back. There is one more after you. My apologies.
Good afternoon. Is there anybody out there? Oh, good. You're a very religious audience, I can see, because there's a lot of people with their head down praying, so I'm not sure. Praying for me to get up here, praying for me to get off, one of those things. All right. Okay. I'm not an academic, which will become abundantly clear when I start to speak. There we go. My name is Dermot Loughnane, and I'll be your presenter this afternoon. My background is I was at sea for 15 years. I'm a master mariner. I have an MBA. I spent 15 years at sea, 6 of them in the Arctic as an ice pilot, and 20 years ashore managing ships, which is when I got to tell people who used to do my old job what to do, and now I'm a consultant, so I get to tell people that do my old job what to do as well. In some ways, I think I may have brought the wrong presentation. I have another presentation called Everything You Know About the Northwest Passage is Wrong, which might have been interesting to get as well, but anyway, another time. I always have this slide for a couple of reasons. I should mention that the work that my company does is we do feasibility analysis for new developments in the Arctic, petroleum, and mostly mining. This is, for those of you who aren't lucky enough to be in the shipping industry, is a ice class Panamax. It was designed for a mine in the Canadian Arctic, and I paid for the design for a client. But by the time the design was done, the project had fallen through, so they never transferred the IP. So I actually own my own design for an ice class Panamax. So if anybody needs one, please see me afterwards because it's for sale and I'll give you a really good price. Okay, I'm very impressed with the people who spoke ad hoc and without notes, but that's not me. I should probably point out a couple of things. One is I have a really bad head cold, and inside my head it sounds like like I've got my head in the toilet, and I've got enough cold medicine that when it's coming out is probably not making much sense either anyway. Okay, so introduction. Actually, this is an interesting picture. This is the MV Arctic. I was the ice pilot on this ship. This was an iceberg detection system. This is how close we had to get to the iceberg to detect it. So they went back to the laboratory with that one. I don't think we saw it again. Yeah, they trialed it on the Titanic. So what I'm going to cover briefly in the 15 minutes or so that I have, I'm going to talk a little bit about the development database that we have, the state of play of development in the Western Arctic, some of the hurdles that have to be overcome for that development to happen, and then because I only got 15 minutes, I'll just talk about a few of the more interesting projects. I'm giving a similar presentation at the Arctic Circle, but it's like an hour and a half, so this is the Reader's Digest version, if you will. I should point out a couple of things. I speak with no authority whatsoever. Everything that I talk about these projects is stuff that's publicly available or that their media departments have given or that in interviewing people that they've told me. So when I say something about a project, I'm not saying I'm Shell or any of the mining companies. It's just what I've read, what I've heard, and what I think I know. And I should also say I don't have a position. Well, I do have a position, but I'm not going to share it with you. About what developments are good and what are bad and which ones are environmentally irresponsive because there's not enough time to really talk about that. Okay, so we have this database which started out as just me doing a list of projects that were going on because my interest is in doing feasibility analysis. It kind of helps you to know what's going on out there in the big wide world. But as those things tend to be, it kind of grew and it ended up being a database. A lot of the work that we've done in the past have been for people like Rio Tinto, BHP, Shell, China Minmetals, who you don't know, and things like that. So that kind of started us down the road, and it grew as a business. We're looking for projects at the pre-feasibility stage, if you know anything about project development. The ones I'll talk about here are ones that have gone further because they're in feasibility and they're much more likely to happen. So it's more valuable to talk about them. We cover the Western Arctic, which is mostly Canada. We're trying to expand it to Alaska, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, etc. But it's actually pretty interesting how much work it takes to add more areas on in terms of the data you have to manage. The information we do have in the database is updated all the time. We have about 50 different data feeds, as well as the interviews and things like that we conduct. Oh yeah, right. I was going to say the things we get news feeds. We're in touch with the media departments of the various companies, and I know a few people having been in the business, forever. So we talk to people as well. This is just an example of some of the projects that are probably within the next 5 years going to come to fruition. And I actually, if you see there in the Beaufort Sea, it's got 2 red stars. That's not because it's been a bad boy, but because I had to add the recent announcement last week from Imperial, Exxon, and BP that they're going to develop their 2 offshore fields there. They're about 175 kilometers from Tuktoyaktuk. You notice there's no stars down south inland because I'm a shipping guy, and so if it doesn't involve a ship, then it's not all that interesting to me. Okay, this is actually a very good map I have from the Chamber of Mines in Nunavik, and it just shows how many mines are at the feasibility stage in the Canadian Arctic. And you can see it's almost, you can't see the map for the number of lines. Now these, there's still a huge amount of doubt around a lot of these, but just gives an idea of the activity that's going on. So just because we don't have that much time, I've kind of turned it around and I'm giving the conclusions first, and I'll give the evidence afterwards. Oil and gas, what I say is it's time for a timeout. Things have definitely slowed down since Shell had some difficulties a few months back. The only thing they did last summer was some seismic. In that weird way that the development world has, I'll talk about Cairn a little bit, but there's actually some activity that's going to happen, and I mentioned about Imperial and Exxon as well. Interestingly enough, with all the downturn in oil exploration in the Chukchi and the Beaufort, there was a little item that came across where a seismic company was retained to do 2D seismic in the Chukchi Sea for a consortium of oil companies, but I couldn't find out who it is. So people are still paying to get seismic, which is an indication, I think, of probably long-term interest. I think, and this is my opinion, I think that the Arctic oil and gas, why I say it's time for a timeout, is I think that maybe internally the oil companies are debating whether or not it's worth it. Not worth it in an economic sense, but worth it that they can get a lot of oil from fracking down in the southern 48 without all the media headlines they get in the Arctic. Fracking, the objections to fracking tend to be more localized and probably easier to manage, where things in the Arctic, well, you saw with Shell and the fine Canadian designed platform they were towing. I mean, it was huge media. It wasn't actually in the Arctic, but it was a huge media event for one grounding, which is not to undercut it. The other thing is that the timelines for oil and gas development tend to be very long, and so taking a couple of years out is probably not going to have a big impact when you're talking about a 20-year development cycle. Moving swiftly on to mining, something that I deal a bit more with, I'd say softly, softly catches the monkey, to quote Kipling. Most of the print you see about development in shipping in the Arctic tends to be about oil and gas, but the reality is that it's actually the mines that tend to progress this thing. I've been going to the Arctic since 1985. I was on the ship that took the first load of crude oil out of Bent Horn in the high Arctic, which was 1986, I think. And there was lots of talk about that, but while that was going on, we'd already been taking lead and zinc out of Little Cornwallis Island and out of Nunavik Mine for a number of years, and they continued a number of years after that. Since then, while we're still not taking oil and gas out of the Arctic, Voisey's Bay has come online, Deception Bay, which are a little further south. Now Baffinlands, which I'll talk about in a minute, and soon it'll advance explorations at Roche Bay. And MMG at Izok Lake will probably start as well. So it's like all the noise tends to be about the oil and gas, but the mining tends to be the one that actually drives the shipping. All right. Okay, so I talked about perception and fracking, so I won't go over that again. The hurdles to overcome, as I said, is that debate internally, maybe. That's just my theory. Mining, of course, tends to be driven by the pricing of base metals. Particularly, most of the mines in the Arctic tend to be base metal mines, lead, zinc, copper, and they follow that kind of pricing cycle. The mines only seem to get developed if the development is kind of occurring on the top of the curve when the prices are high. Base metal mines were all going to be developed in 2008, and then it all came to a halt pretty quickly after that. Okay, the next section of my presentation, the one that I'm going to have to kind of breeze through, is the various projects that are ongoing in the Arctic. And like I said, this is just a brief overview, and I'll be going into it at length, probably too much length, at the Arctic Circle at the end of the week. So Baffinland, the Mary River Mine, which is probably the one that people have heard the most about, is actually moving ahead. I mean, it has been on death watch for a number of times, but they signed their benefit agreement with the local population. They announced their construction schedule. They had a huge sea lift this summer, and they hope to be in production by 2015. Now, the only reason there's a question mark on that is that I met with them last week at a different conference, and I'm pretty sure he told me 2015, but I put a question mark next to it anyway. It's produced, I don't know, people probably don't follow it all that closely, but it actually is it's proceeding on a reduced scope. Originally, it was going to be 18 million tons, and now they've, because of markets and financing, they've cut it back to 3.5 million tons. One of the big shareholders of Baffinland Mines is ArcelorMittal, the huge steel company, and they've got some debt problems, so I think that's probably affected things. It's interesting in that they're going to have, the original plan was to have about 8 to 12 very large Cape-size, very high ice class bulk carriers. Unfortunately, not interested in my design, but anyway. And now it's been reduced down to smaller ships, though eventually they'll end up being Suezmax. Another interesting one that's not been much in the news is it's called Oceanic Mines. It's an iron ore mine in northern Quebec. And it's actually got 1.36 billion tons of proven and provable and proven iron ore. It's huge. And they've completed a product optimization, and they just finished their shipping study. So they're still in pre-feasibility, but it looks very positive for them, that's for sure. This mine, I include it. It doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell of ever happening, but it's kind of a favorite of mine. It's a company called Westar in Vancouver, and they own a huge amount of acreage, like 180,000 acres on Ellesmere Island. I can't tell you how far north this is. This is like within, I think, 100 miles of Eureka, which is a weather station, Canada's northernmost weather station. So if you could find a harder place to get in and out of with a commodity that's worth less, I can't think of it. But they're kind of like, gutsy kind of, you got spunk kid type companies, so I quite like them. Advanced Explorations, they have a mine in Roche Bay called, I don't know if it has a name, Roche Bay. They're interesting. They're trying to do some things a little different. They've already signed an agreement for their shipping. They're talking about having everything on site being powered by LNG rather than having diesel fuel hauled in. And they just recently raised funds through a private placement, which was oversubscribed. So there's a pretty positive view on that. Canadian Royalties, they had a mine called Nunavik Nickel. This is kind of not a great story. They were taken over by the Gin Nickel Industry Company in 2010, who invested $50 million in the development of its nickel mine. But unfortunately, on July 19th, they handed it over to the bank because they owed about $70 million, I think, on it, and they've just walked away. So the future of that one is somewhat up in the air. MMG, the Izok Corridor project. This is a project that's been around. I worked on it in the middle 1990s. I worked on it again in 2007, and God knows I'll probably work on it somewhere down the road. But it's interesting because it's lead, zinc, copper that has to come a couple hundred miles by road out to Coronation Gulf. They're actually tying together three mines, the High Lake Hood River Mine and the Izok Mine. And their new plan is to bring the mines on one after another, like work one mine, have it go down the road, bring on a second mine, and bring on the third mine. So they're going to extend the life of the mine with using the same equipment and therefore have a higher return. All right, I'm going to move through a couple of these. The oil development ones, they pretty much follow the same script. Anything that has Shell in front of it is basically on hold. Statoil and the Chukchi, they completed seismic but announced that they weren't going to do any drilling until at least 2015. ConocoPhillips, this was a direct quote, waiting for the regulatory environment to gain some clarity. So read into that what you like. This is interesting. This is a Malagok, which has been around since the 80s. It was its largest discovery in the Canadian Beaufort. It was done by Gulf Oil Bodrill. It's now owned by ConocoPhillips, and it's one of those ones that it's just kind of it's continued along without anybody paying too much attention to it. They provided me with this time frame, which I found was very interesting at how long it was. I previously referred to taking the first load of crude oil out of Ben Horn in the high Arctic. That was, as I said, about 1986. It took about 2 years to develop that. So what was 2 years is now 20 years, which is, I could tell you about Ben Horn and you'd say, yeah, you should have spent more time developing it, so we'll leave that. Here's the one that was just announced last week, which is Imperial Oil, which is Exxon in Canada. BP, and their two fields are Rujak and Pokak, which are the ones that are in 1,500 meters of water. They've applied to start drilling, but I don't think they'll start drilling until 2020. Chevron and the Beaufort, Chevron are doing some optimization studies, but they haven't committed to anything beyond that. And I'm getting to the end of my time. I wanted to put this up. This is a list of all the licenses that have been awarded in Greenland. I mean, I couldn't get it so you could read the print. There's that many of it. It's that active. The most significant things, I won't bother with that one, is this mine for, what's it called? It's an Australian company. Sorry. It's the largest rare earth, would be the largest rare earth mine outside of China. The problem there is that as well as rare earths, it also contains uranium. There's going to be a vote by the Greenlandic Parliament on October 24th on whether to lift their ban on mining rare earths. And if they decide to go ahead, then it's going to be pretty interesting. It's going to be a pretty big mine. What I find interesting about Greenland as an observer is that while they stopped the last licensing round for that they started, when they had the new government come in, their premier has also been quoted as saying that mining is the only thing that's kind of going to develop Greenland. They had fishing, but fishing's kind of not going to be able to take them where they want to go. So it seems interesting that at the same time as they're stopping awarding any new licenses, they're also kind of betting the farm on mining. Another favorite of mine, and I've done some work on this one, it's another Australian company called Ironbark, and their mine is called Citronin, which I think probably means lemons. But this is interesting that it's kind of like the West Star one. It is like the most god-awful place you could think of to put a mine. This is the northeast coast of Greenland, and the very hard multi-year ice from the North Pole comes right down in front of that mine. So it's, again, like if you were looking for a really tough place to put it, you couldn't find one that was tougher. But the feasibility work they've done have revealed that it's got a return on if it works out, the return on invested capital will be about 32%. So I think they're going to pursue that. Shell has made no announcement about drilling in Greenland. Cairn has committed to drilling offshore Greenland in 2014, which is fascinating because they lost about $600 million last year. Basically, the money they make in other places is paying for the wells that they're drilling off of Greenland. And that's the end of my show. That's the picture on the ferry back to Victoria, where I'll be in about another week. Thanks very much.